It's nice to be back again. Thanks for inviting me, Misak, and thanks for attending, and it's lovely to see familiar faces from last year. So I have to admit that this lecture or this session is more recent work, so it's not something I've been working on for a decade. So I'm just presenting some initial findings and basically exploring this very rapidly growing area of research with you today. So I'm sort of showing you what some of the paths might be, what some of the sources people are using to research antiquities dealers, and what potentially some of the results might be once the field has grown. So I began research on this in 2015 when I was using the Victoria and Albert Museum archives, and I was sort of an in-between stage between moving back to the UK and starting my job at Lincoln, and I was amazed to discover some fascinating correspondence between the Victoria and Albert Museum and Armenian dealers, and as a result of that I developed those research findings into an article that I finally published in 2020. Since then I've broadened out my search away from the Victoria and Albert Museum. I've included the British Museum in my research, so I've looked at the relationships between the British Museum and these Armenian dealers, who I'll come to a bit later. And I was lucky in May of this past year, 2023, to visit the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, where I had a visiting researcher fellowship. So I was able to use the archives of the Gulbenkian Museum, which were Kalush Gulbenkian's correspondence with Armenian dealers. So I got further into the relationships between sort of parallel dealers and collectors who were active in the early 20th century. And as a result of that, I also turned in the direction of focusing more on researching the background of the dealers. So I got some funding to do some fieldwork over last summer in Turkey at the Ottoman Archives in Istanbul, going to the sort of place of origins of the dealers in Kayseri in central Anatolia as well, and trying to find out about how they started out in antiquities dealing. And then I also went to Yerevan and tried to do some research into some rare Armenian printed books there about the Armenian dealers and finding out some more history. So, and then adding on to that, so I did the Gulbenkian Museum, the V&A, the British Museum, Istanbul Ottoman Archives, Yerevan National Library, and then this past January I've updated that to visit America, where I was lucky enough to access some private dealer family papers at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So that was when I really started to get the research going, to find out more about how the dealers organize their works from inside. So yeah, it's a growing sort of area of my research that's being updated more or less as we speak. So for this reason, because the talk's being recorded, I haven't included a lot of my latest findings, and I haven't included a lot of the wonderful images that I have from my research, because I haven't got the official permission to upload those onto the internet yet. So all of the images that I'm showing today are my images that I have permission for, or that are public domain images. So anyway, that's just a preliminary note about the nature of this research and how it's a work in progress. Going back to introduce myself, I'm sure many of you heard all this last year, so I'll keep it brief. But I'm Alyson Wharton-Durgaryan. Since I married my husband, I've typically worked on Ottoman architecture and the role of Armenian architects in late Ottoman architecture of the 19th century, and those very famous palaces like Dolmabahce Palace here that was constructed in 1856, and how these palaces reflected the European education of these Armenian architects, their sort of working this education towards the taste of the Sultan and reformulating the Ottoman imperial style in the middle of the 19th century. And I also worked on the background of those imperial works, how they relied on Armenian teams as a result of their sort of social capital that they built up within the Armenian community because of their very important role as sort of noble figures. semi-noble figures. Then since about 2015, I've been publishing mainly on Armenian architects who are working in the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So I moved away from the capital of Constantinople, and I found out that there were lots of parallel cases of Armenian architects who are working in different cities across eastern Anatolia or western Armenia, who were equally important in constructing the cities over the last decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. So that's primarily what I've worked on in the past. So as you can see from that, going into Antiquities dealers is a whole different ballgame for me, and it relies a lot more on work in museum archives, so navigating, museum politics and getting permission to see certain documents that may be viewed to be a little bit sensitive from the perspective of perhaps some museum directors and administrations, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So anyway, that's me. So today, as I said, this is just to showcase some initial findings and sort of discuss with you what is art historical research about provenance. So provenance is researching, as I'll come back to many times, the history of objects. So where do objects in museums that are now in museum collections worldwide, where do these objects come from, and how did they make their journeys from those places to the museum collections? So I'll introduce this subject of research, how we can engage in this kind of research, what sources are available, why is this an important area of research, why is it particularly taken off, the last few years, why are Armenians in particular significant for provenance research, why did they play such a leading role as art and antiquities dealers at a crucial moment when the art trade, particularly in Oriental antiquities, or what is known as Islamic art now, as interest in collecting those kind of objects really took off. What do we know about these Armenians? So I've researched a handful of Armenian dealers in detail, but there are many more examples that I won't cover today, some of which have parallel stories and are equally important. So I've already mentioned what methods can we use to find out more about them and make some suppositions about what the research might lead to. So how might museums change their displays? How might they change their descriptions about provenance as a result of this research? So let's go back to this word, provenance, which you may not have heard of before attending this session. It's sort of a word that's relatively limited to the context of museum work. So I thought I would explain to you by showing this example. So this is a picture of the Jamil Gallery for Islamic Middle Eastern artworks in the Victoria and Albert Museum. I'm sure some of you, maybe even all of you, have visited that gallery. So it was recently displayed, probably about a decade ago. They got some funding from the Jamil family to redisplay these artworks and to modernize the gallery. So when you go into the gallery, you'll see all these objects displayed, you'll see tiles on the walls, you'll see carpets, you'll see velvets, all sorts of things that, as I said, can be described as Islamic art. And alongside them, you will see these plaques. So these plaques will give you some information about the objects that you are seeing. And they will tell you about the history of the objects, when it was made perhaps, where the object used to stand, in this case for a minbar such as this. So this specific example is a minbar, which is like a sort of a preacher's pulpit from which the Friday sermon would be read in a mosque. So it's a very important part of religious furniture in a mosque. And this is not just any pulpit, this is a very historically important pulpit that was in a imperial sultanic mosque in Cairo, in Egypt, coming from the Mamluk Empire, which was an early modern Islamic empire that ruled over vast territories in the Middle East, from its capital in Cairo. So this was a wooden minbar constructed from inlaid wood, carefully carved by Mamluk craftsmen, And this was made for Sultan Kayt in 1468 to 96. And we have quite a lot of specific information about this particular artwork because it has inscriptions and it has things that give us information about the date of construction and who it was made for. And we know it comes from that specific place. So it's an unusual example to start off with. But I thought I would go from the better known examples to then the lesser known examples to show you how in some cases we have a lot of information, in other cases we have very little. So this is a better known, this is a very famous work of art. So the gallery label, as I said, don't worry, you don't need to read this, this is just to demonstrate. In this case, for this object, the minbar, the gallery label lists a lot of historical information that is known about this particular pulpit. So as I said, we know when it was made, we know who it was made for, we know which mosque it was standing in, we know a lot about the patron who was Sultan Kayt Bey, who was a very powerful Mamluk Sultan. We also know that it was made with wood, with ivory, so it gives us this gallery label tends to focus on the historical information about that object. So where it came from, when it was made, who it was made for, perhaps the name of a craftsman if we know that. And it also focuses on materials and techniques. So this is made from wood, this is inlaid with ivory, and any other details about the materials or the techniques will be listed on this gallery information sort of card, gallery label. So anyway, now we have the internet. This information is also available on the Victoria and Albert Museum website. So the gallery label on the website is actually longer than the museum label, as you can see. So what that label doesn't tend to include is the object history. So for the Victoria and Albert Museum, for other museums it's different. Sometimes there is a brief object history that's included on the labels within the galleries. But for the case of the Victoria and Albert Museum, by and large, you have to go to the website to get the long object history of that particular item. So this object history gives what is known about the history of the object from when it was made to when it entered the museum collections. So again, this is quite unusual, this example, because it's a very famous work of art. So because it was a very famous and also a monumental, it's a very large work of art, it couldn't be, stolen away, wrapped and put in a backpack or smuggled across the border. It was very difficult to take this kind of object away from a mosque because of its size and also because of its fame or its notoriety. So instead, this particular minbar or pulpit served as a sort of exhibition piece, actually for the Egyptian sort of nationalist or the intellectuals who were wanting to display the sort of glories of Egyptian historical art at the World Expositions at the turn of the 20th century. So this minbar actually was transported to Paris in 1867 and was displayed as an example of, the glories of Egyptian historical art by intellectuals that had made a pavilion to display various objects at that exposition. So after that exhibition, it says here, in 1869, following discussions at a parliamentary select committee in London, the South Kensington Museum, which is the historical name for the V&A, was authorised to buy this collection, this whole collection of Egyptian objects that was displayed in Paris. So for this reason, for this object, you have quite a specific and well-documented history that results in a sale that is deemed to be sort of legal according to the documentation that survives. So it's quite unusual that we have this much information about an object. So in contrast, we have few objects like this as well. It's very important to state that museum galleries are full of objects, and there are very few very famous objects that are fully documented like that example. Instead, when you go to a gallery, you see walls of tiles, and you also see on the website many more objects that are in storage. So items like this tile fragment, let's say, because there are quite big chunks that no longer remain of this tile. Items like this are by and large in storage, so you wouldn't know about these unless you searched on the V&A websites. But it's a credit to museums like the V&A and like, the Metropolitan Museum that the websites do display these items. They're not completely hidden away. They are all catalogued, and they are all searchable within the search engine of the website. But as you can see from this information, there's only 2 lines for the object history of this tile. So it says, object history in this part, from the Yeşil Türbe, or the Green Tomb at Bursa, built for the Osmanli Sultan Çelebi Mehmed I, who was ruling from 1413 to 1421. So it's known that it comes from that particular building in Bursa. Bursa was the first capital of the Ottoman Empire. And in Bursa you have a group of buildings that are of a very distinctive style. And they're all decorated with these polychrome tiles that were produced in a very specific technique, which is called cuir de seca, which is a technique that has this sort of effect of tile, almost like tile mosaic, that you have these black lines and then you have the colour inside the black lines. So we definitely know for sure that it came from that location because it's such a distinctive tile that those simply aren't found any other period, any other place. So for sure they're from that building. But nothing else is known. All that can be gathered is that it entered the V&A collection around 1892 because the object number, which shows up in the search, which you can see just slightly there, has 1892 on the end of it. So it's from that you know that it entered the collection in 1892. So that's all we know, that it came from Bursa, it got to the V&A 1892, it was purchased presumably and entered the collection. So that's just an example of something about which we have very little information, but at least in that case, because it's so distinctive, we know that it came from that specific building, whereas from other ones, for a ceramic plate, for instance, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't have that ability to fix the original location. So this is a picture, one of my own pictures. I didn't have pictures of the mausoleum, unfortunately. I don't know why. I'm sure I do somewhere, but I couldn't find them. And so all I could find was this picture of the Green Mosque, which is the mosque to which the mausoleum is connected. So you can see there, anyway, even though it's a very dark, poor picture, that the walls of the mosque are lined with these lovely hexagonal tiles. You have an inscription in tiles that goes all the way around, and you have this huge mihrab, which is the prayer niche to which you face when you're performing your prayers towards Mecca. And the mihrab itself is completely covered in tiles too. So that's just to show you an example of how these buildings from this period are covered in tiles, and how those tiles that we just saw that were in the Victoria and Albert Museum must have been removed from one of these buildings, namely the mausoleum that I just mentioned, at some points, perhaps 1890s. So, to sort of give you a bit more context about why this has become more of an issue for museums, particularly, the past few decades and reaching a fever pitch to some extent in recent years. Why has this become a very pressing issue that museums need to engage in more research about the histories of their objects and where they came from, in what conditions? So there are some very famous cases where objects that are now in Western museums had come from situations that were obvious colonial situations. So in 1897 we have the punitive expedition to Benin, through which the British were overthrowing the local ruler, the Oba. The Oba then had to go into exile, and the British established their control in the Kingdom of Benin. As part of this process of colonization, they stormed the Oba's palace, and they took out all of the valuable antiquities. So this is a photograph, a notorious photograph that displays all of these antiquities that are lined up in front of the British soldiers. And many of these objects are now in the British Museum's collection, including these wonderful sort of, I forget what they are, sort of panthers. The most famous examples are the bronze plaques that are called the Benin bronzes, that are bronze plaques that used to adorn the walls of the Oba's palace. So they were pulled down from the walls of the palace, transported to England, and now are displayed in the British Museum. And there have been campaigns to have these objects sent back to Benin, and I think recently some plaques did actually return from a German gallery. So different countries, different museums have different policies, obviously, but as far as I know, objects haven't gone back from the British Museum so far. So there are very clear-cut cases, such as this, of looting, essentially. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that it's different from what we're going to discuss in a minute. I'm not saying that the Armenians are engaged in looting. I'm saying that there are very obvious cases of colonial looting that we have that include the example of the looting of the Oba's palace and the Benin bronzes. And this has led to this sort of interest in provenance and the need for museums to research the provenance of their objects. We also have the other very famous case, which is Nazi looted art. So many of you will have seen the movie a few years ago, The Monuments Men, which was all about this team of curators that were employed by the army to try and preempt the seizure of artworks by the Nazis, and they managed to collect 1,000 works of art or something like that, so that the Nazis couldn't get their hands on them. The sad truth is that the Nazis actually did succeed in gathering the majority of German, Jewish, and other Jewish populations' artworks. So you can see one example here. That's a famous photograph from the German archives of German soldiers in front of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome in 1943 with a wonderful Italianate painting taken from the Naples Archaeological Museum. So there's been a lot more movement on this Nazi looted art within the museum world for obvious reasons, because the Holocaust is an acknowledged fact. There's a sort of large and vocal lobby within the worldwide Jewish population to get these artworks back, to get some kind of restitution or at least compensation for the artworks that were taken. So particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of German institutions to more collaboration and to researching this aspect of their collections, there's been a promotion of research on German looted art. So 1990s, early 2000s has really picked up speed. It's taken quite a long time until now, but there's been a lot of research about it the last 2 decades. So the culmination of this, to some extent, is this document here called the Washington Principles. So the Washington Principles were agreed in 1998 they are principles of the Washington Conference with respect to Nazi confiscated art, published in connection with the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets, which took place in Washington, D.C. on the 3rd of December 1998. So there are a number of principles that countries needed to sign up to in 1998 to show their sort of willingness, their due diligence to research Nazi looted art and to do certain steps to try and discover this Nazi looted art and to then restitute it or compensate for it. So there were a huge number of countries that did actually sign up to this. I don't know the number, but it's certainly in the teens. And a large number of countries signed up for this that were actually responsible for various aspects of colonial looting. So the fact that they'd signed up to these principles has actually been putting pressure on those countries to research their own colonial looting as well as to research Nazi looting. So although it was written to first encourage research and restitution about the Nazi cases, it's actually led to a widespread sort of research effort about all kinds of looting. So the terms include things like, number one, art that has been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted should be identified. Number two, relevant records and archives should be open and accessible to researchers in accordance with the guidelines of the International Conference on Archives. Number three, resources and personnel should be made available to facilitate the identification of all art that has been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted. So yes, there's a number of points that put pressure on governments and institutions to actively research into the provenance of objects. So there's a number of pressures as a result of those cases, those examples. There's also the very real political pressure, immediate political pressure of populist governments on museums. I'm sure you've all heard about, Sisi or Erdogan complaining about specific objects that are held in European museums. Erdogan's particularly obsessed with these tile lintels that are in the Louvre Museum in Paris, which were taken from the Piale Pasha Mosque in Constantinople in Istanbul. And they're a very distinctive set of lintels that are in a style and a particular colour mixture that only comes from that mosque. So again, you can pinpoint that those certainly came from that mosque. So Erdogan keeps putting pressure that these, are stolen, they have to be returned. But the Louvre, in return has said these were purchased legally at the time. So there continues to be a back and forth. But at the end of the day, the Turkish government can use its leverage to prevent loans of objects for other exhibitions that might be required. There have been exhibitions that have had objects that were requested from Turkey in the past that have been denied as a result of these kind of political sort of demands anyway, behind the scenes. There's also, the past few years, a much wider decolonizing movement, as it's called, that's taken all fields, all academic fields of study in the UK by storm, that was sort of begun by a number of things and sort of culminated to some extent by the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol a few years ago. And as a result of that, a number of organisations and fields of study have looked more introspectively about their ethnic makeup, the diversity within the organisation, and how to encourage greater diversity both internally and as their sort of external image. So there was, for instance, the Race, Ethnicity and Equality report by the Royal Historical Society, which returned findings that were perhaps not surprising, that the historical profession is overwhelmingly white and needs to do something quite rapidly to change that situation. The Museums Association issued decolonising principles to help to guide museum staff to better incorporate diverse voices within museum displays, to engage in outreach and these kind of things. And the National Trust is perhaps the most famous example of encouraging research into the colonial legacy of its historical houses. So the UK is quite, an important, let's say, forerunner in this, and has been making great strides in the past few years. If you go to museum websites, like this one is the website of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, they usually have a whole page on decolonising the museum or provenance research, And there they list a number of initiatives that they're sponsoring to do background research about certain areas, problematic areas of their collections. The Metropolitan Museum, again, is quite an important forerunner in terms of employing provenance researchers. They have 2 full-time provenance researchers at the Met Museum who are actively engaged in researching the problematic collections, and they've returned a number of objects to Egypt and to other countries recently as a result of problematic provenance. And even the website is quite commendable in terms of giving that information of provenance about each object. And again, this is a well-known carpet, so it has a fairly detailed provenance about, being held by Dikran Kalekian until 1929, then sold to Brady and then sold to Lehman later on. So it's an unusual example to some extent where you do have a fuller list of transactions that can be pieced together. But I should point out that some other museum websites don't even list that information. So, there are some, like the V&A, like the Metropolitan Museum, that do have it open access, but there are others that don't. So it's a rapidly changing situation. So let's go back to what is provenance research. So it's basically, there are different kinds of fields of study and specialisms. There are some people who are full-time professional provenance researchers. I'm not one of those. I'm an art historian. So therefore, I'm sort of learning on the job to a greater extent than perhaps, my colleague who's a provenance researcher for the German federal government, for instance, and she's been doing provenance research for decades and has been trained within that system. So some of the things that I say now will be based on my experience more so than perhaps a fully trained provenance researcher. So what kind of scholarly means can we use to try and discover how objects reached the museum, to shed more light on this provenance section that may be very thin for certain objects like the tiles that I showed? We can go as a first step to museum archives, if they'll let you in, that is, if they'll give you permission, and that even varies from city to city. So museum archives usually keep records of acquisitions. So when they buy an object, there's usually some kind of document there to show that. They usually carry out inventories at certain periods through the history of the gallery, and so they will have a list of all the objects that they have in that particular section, and sometimes they'll mention where they came from. They'll have bills of sale, which will be the receipts that would go back and forth between the dealers and the museums. And they would also have letters. So they would have letters where the dealers were contacting the museums, offering them objects, and then the museum curators or keepers would be writing back to the dealers and saying whether they wanted to buy the objects or not, and then to sort of bargain about the price. So there's quite a lot that can be found even just within the museums. Then, if we want to find out more about specific dealers or specific objects, we can go to National Archives, Municipal Archives, and Local Archives to find out about, customs, the movement of objects across borders if they were recorded. In most cases, they weren't, of course. They might be items that were found illegally and therefore recorded for that reason. Or there might be some other background information we can find about the dealers, their businesses, or other employees in particular countries. The richest source of information that I've been lucky to have access to recently is family papers of dealers. So at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, they have a wonderful archive that was left by Dikran Kalekian, who was one of the leading dealers of Oriental artworks or Islamic artworks. He also dealt in Far Eastern artworks and also in Impressionist paintings. So he was a particularly active, wealthy, powerful dealer, and so his papers are numerous. They have, a lot of boxes of information that give you background about his operations. And there are other parallel examples. There's the Adrian Minassian collection that's been donated to Brown University in America. So different families kept documentation and then have deposited those archives to whatever museum, whatever gallery or library they had a connection to. We also have excavation records, descriptions of excavation sites. Many of the individuals that I'll discuss in a minute are accused of taking objects from unregulated excavations. So, we can try and counter that with descriptions of the excavations from the time or from excavation reports that might mention their presence or the presence of their contacts. Transportation company records. So these are really important because the objects had to be transported from Constantinople to wherever it was, Bradford, and then down to London. I found an Armenian temporary consulate established in Bradford, and then they brought the objects down to the British Museum from there, which sounds unlikely, but there you go. So transportation is really important, particularly there's a very controversial case that I'll hopefully mention at the end if I have time, where objects were taken from Nazi-occupied Paris to Berlin. And there, the only evidence that survives of the movement of those objects is the transportation companies. So they can give us clues where we don't have anything else. Archives relating to the territory where objects came from, so the Ottoman archives that I've used recently. Egyptian archives, I've heard that a lot was destroyed, so there may not remain very much information from that perspective. I don't read Persian or speak Persian, so I haven't tried to look into what's in Iran, but again, there might be pathways that you can pursue there. In the Ottoman archive, there isn't a lot of documentation, but there are mentions from time to time, particularly when something illegal is being done and the Ottoman authorities want to flag that up. Or conversely, when the Ottoman state wants to publicise itself abroad, in which case they will keep an antiquities dealer sort of in the service of the Ottoman Empire, and they will send him abroad with objects to represent the empire. So it's either way if they're in trouble or if they're being used for promotion or propaganda. Legislation governing sale of antiquities, and this is really important. So there's been a growing area of study of Ottoman antiquities legislation recently. So it's really important to establish if what these dealers were doing was legal, particularly within the local frameworks of legality. Obviously there's lots of behind-the-scenes documentation or bartering or bribery that we'll never be able to find, so we can't know, who actually agreed to many of these transactions, which is a shortcoming, obviously, of our research methods. There's also printed text, there's sale catalogues, newspaper reports of sales, and catalogues of dealers' collections or sort of private collections that in often cases they publish themselves. So this is one example of an inventory. This was sort of mid-20th century, so it's not very detailed. It's from the Minassian archive at Brown University. So it lists items, it lists prices that were sort of the targets, and then it lists the sold prices or the costs, and then the sold prices. So it's fairly minimal, but you get at least an idea of what kind of items were being sold to whom and for what price. Right, so just to give you an indication of an example of a document you would find if you went to the British Museum, this is a wonderful object that's in the British Museum today. It's a copper alloy rhyton with a bull's head at the front, a spout through which you could pour water, so it's a sort of vessel for drinking or for watering something, and it had four legs that were cast from copper alloy. So I found in 1894, so this is quite early on actually, this dealer, Armenian dealer, Krikor Minassian, contacted the British Museum and offered this list of items for sale. Amongst that list was this copper rhyton. At the time, it was described here, bronze rhyton in the form of a mythical animal with having the horns and ears of a, I don't know what that says. Anyway, it was found at Mosul, and it's described as Babylonian, which is interesting as well at the time, because they didn't know, necessarily what was a later Islamic object, and they confused many of the later objects that are now known to be Islamic objects with Babylonian, because that was a category that was more, attractive to the keepers at the time, like Wallis Budge. So he was successful in convincing Budge that it was Babylonian, and so Budge purchased it, and it was one of the earliest purchases from Minassian. So we think that they probably arrived in London around sort of many of these dealers, 1892, 1893, 1894, because that's the earliest documents that we have for them. This is another example. This is a bit later, Hagop Kevorkian, who's contacting the Victorian Albert Museum in 1898, and this is the first letter we have from him. So, 5 years later, he comes along, and instead of offering Babylonian objects, he's offering what he calls Oriental objects of art. And most of these are what would be called now Islamic objects. So they include Ottoman Iznik, what are now called Iznik, but they called them Rhodian back then, ceramics, manuscripts, a Persian manuscript, lots of odd bits and pieces. There's even a saddle, and things that would basically be in elite collections in the Ottoman Empire, and then he gathered them together, transported them to London, and offered them to the Victorian Albert Museum. So those are just two examples of moments of arrival of these dealers who travelled all the way from Constantinople to London, and this is what they offered first to the museums. So to rewind a bit, who were the leading dealers of the time? Who were the Armenians that I've been researching so far? So these are the three figures that I've done the most digging about. Kukor Minassian, who's shown in the top. This is a photo from the Minassian archive, and he's depicted here in his shop with all these ceramics hanging in the background. Hagop Kevorkian, who I just mentioned, who was 1872 to 1962, and he worked for some time alongside Kalus Gulbenkian. He had quite close connections with Gulbenkian, and then seems to have continued in his antiquities trade on his own after a short partnership with Gulbenkian. But the one who I found the most on is Dikran Kalekian, who was perhaps born 1867 or 68 in Kayseri, and lived until 1951, where he tragically died in New York. So these Armenians were extremely prolific. They're significant purely because of the number of objects that they managed to transport from Constantinople and later, Iran or Egypt to Western museums. So if you search on the websites that I've already gone on about a lot, if you put in Kalekian, 502 results. If you put in Minassian, you'll get 170 results. If you put in Kevorkian, you'll get 1,165 results. And this is just from the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is a notable example because the person who established the Islamic art collection, Charles Freer, which was then the Freer Gallery, was particularly active in collecting Islamic art early on when these Armenian dealers were very active. So at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of Islamic objects got sold by Armenian dealers to Charles Freer and ended up in the Freer Gallery, which is now Smithsonian. So they're significant because they were there at this moment when the trade and also the demand for Islamic, or what they call Oriental objects, really took off. And they were able, through their connections, to transport these objects from Constantinople, later from Persia to Paris, and then to New York, and get them to America. So what do we know so far about these dealers? So this is based on my research, but also on some other individuals who've done bits and pieces. It's amazing that they, by and large, all originate from Kayseri or Caesarea. And they all originate around the 1860s or 1870s, at this moment, as I said, when the trade in Oriental objects really takes off. Then they move to Constantinople around the 1890s, establish a shop there as a base for holding their antiquities. Often then, shortly after, they move to Paris and establish a shop there, or in London. And they use that for holding their objects, and then those objects would then be taken to New York or elsewhere on demand. So Kelekian, for instance, had an absolutely huge storage that he described as, like the vault of a bank in Paris that was filled with objects, and all of the objects had these little numbers on that can still be seen today in individual gallery collections. This had to be transported in a hurry when the Second World War hit to New York, so there was some disruption then when it was all shipped across the Atlantic. But for the vast majority of his career, he had this main base in Paris. They opened shops in America about 1890s to 1900s, and if you go to the Minassian and the Kelekian archive, you have photographs of these shops, and it's wonderful to see the displays and the interiors of the shops and how they evolved through time. Around 1900s, they seemed to close their Constantinople offices. We think that it might be the result of a sort of collapse of Armenian businesses generally at that time as a result of the bankruptcy sort of proceedings that were filed as a result of certain sort of failures of business lapses of the Istanbul Stock Exchange. So there were financial reasons, but there were also obviously the catastrophic impact of the Hamidian massacres, which wiped out a lot of their supply networks across Anatolia. And if you read the documents from the family archives and also from the Ottoman archives, you can just see how much they relied on their family members that were stretched out in different areas in Anatolia. They had an uncle in Bursa, another uncle in Kayseri. So these family members would have been, either murdered or they would have been displaced by the Hamidian massacres, and so it wasn't possible to have access to those regions after the 1890s. So around 1900s, they start to network a lot more with the Persian royal family, the Qajars, and in New York, Dikran Kelekian becomes an honorary consul for the Persian Empire. And you start seeing many more Persian objects are being supplied to the American and the British collections. You also see at the turn of the 1900s redirection from Constantinople to Cairo, and this sort of Egyptomania taking off, and that reaches a peak in sort of 1920s, 1930s, with huge numbers of Egyptian objects, particularly going to the States and places like the Metropolitan Museum. As I mentioned before, during World War II, many of them relocated. Kelekian closed his business in Paris and moved to America for good. And also Minassian, by 1930s, had left Europe and established himself more firmly in the US. And the last thing is that some of these dealers started to sort of present themselves more as dealers in Western art as time went on, because they saw the rise of the demand for Impressionist and modern French art, particularly in American collections. So Dikran Kelekian is particularly known for very profitable sales of French painting in the 1920s and 1930s in America. So he's the man who's known for taking the Impressionists to the United States. Another reason why they're so powerful is they just, they read the zeitgeist, and so he shifts at exactly the right moment from Oriental art to Egyptian, and then to modern art or Parisian Impressionists. So it's a very clever sense of where the market is going, where the business is going. So I think I'll just very quickly talk about a few aspects of that and then finish. So we have their origins in Kayseri. Again, I said it's very striking how they all come from this certain region of Anatolia. I've understood that as a way to sort of give them power in the early stages, because they were by and large from this sort of stock of noble families who were known as the Amira class, who were sort of these dynastic families that went back perhaps to the Cilician royal families, or earlier generations of nobility, going back to historic Armenian presence in the region. So many of them, like Gulbenkian's a better known example, but also Kalekian. He wasn't counted amongst the known noble families, but he clearly had a very wealthy family origin. And that wealth was able to transport him to Constantinople fairly quickly and establish his shop in Constantinople on the back of his father's career as a banker. So I think that class, or this sort of elevated social position, was really important in establishing their businesses and giving them the ability to move to Constantinople very early on, and also to network, because, as I said before, they were all from Kayseri, so they all helped one another. So this was the Antiquities market in Kayseri, the Vizier Khan, which is now being restored, and it's now a carpet seller market if you visit Kayseri today. But in the 18th century and the 19th century, it was filled with Armenian traders who were trading in various textiles and metalwork. So they had a really strong position in the local antiquities market already, from the 18th century, and then building. Imagine in the 19th century you have the railway, the steamship, so this allowed them to connect to international markets and take their wares all the way to Manchester and so on. What's significant about them all is that they didn't tend to use Armenian in corresponding with one another. So Armenians from this region of Anatolia in the middle tended to use Armeno-Turkish. So this was, as you can see here, some Armenian letters, but when you read it, it says Turkish. And even when it's telegrams, you can just read it and it's Turkish. It's just plain Turkish, and it's quite colloquial as well, which is really interesting. It's quite a different tone to read from Ottoman documents, for instance. So it's actually easier in a way. So they often use this to communicate with one another. So Gulbenkian writing to Minassian about some tiles that were perhaps taken from a mosque bath in Constantinople, or when Kevorkian and Gulbenkian set up their own carpet business, all the transactions, all the business correspondence was all in this language, in Armeno-Turkish. So they often used it for communication with one another. So what were their shops like when they moved to Constantinople? Most of them were based around the Grand Bazaar. I'm sure many of you have visited or seen images of the Grand Bazaar and know what it's like, all these rows of shops. And we have the trade directories from the time that list many Armenian names, particularly in certain trades, in certain markets. This in particular was a market that was inhabited by Armenian traders, and we know that Krikor Minassian was based here. It's called Kuzlar Arsihan. As you can see, it's kind of falling down now. It's in need of restoration. But if you wander through there, you can get a wonderful idea of what it was like, because it still has the architectural shape. So it's a very tall building from the outside. It's very secure, which is really important for storing antiquities. So it had to be able to keep out thieves. And then on the inside, it has this courtyard, and then 2 stories of rooms, and then these rooms around the courtyard, you can see the doors to the rooms there. And then in the middle you had a fountain, sometimes you had a mosque if they were bigger ones. So this was where the Armenians started their business. They had a shop there. And it was inhabited by other Armenian businesses, and so they already started to sort of look out for one another and develop their businesses together in those early years. And so this served as a place to keep antiquities whilst they were waiting to be transported elsewhere. So, as I said already, in the 1890s, they start to move to become mobile. People like Kalekian, Gulbenkian, Minassian, they probably didn't spend that much time in Constantinople after 1890. They were moving everywhere. And in fact, if you look at the museum correspondence, they're always writing from different hotels and different locations. And I think, honestly, they never went back really for any period more than a few days. So from the 1890s, they start to target London in particular. They really focus on London first, and then they go to the States shortly after. Gulbenkian and Kalekian both go to the British Museum with huge amounts of coins, particularly Greek and Roman coins, coming from Anatolia. And they came with 10 coins at a time, even 20 or 30 coins at a time, and then offered them to the keeper to see if he was interested. A lot of the time I found that the coins may have had some, local significance for them in terms of they related to sort of perhaps Proto-Armenian sort of groups within the empires. So they may have, I think, been able to sell the wares by communicating with the keepers based on their indigenous knowledge. In any case, they sold successfully, and they managed to engage in sale of large numbers of coins at this point. So in 1892, you start to see these dealers crop up in the Ottoman archives, and the Ottoman authorities start to complain that Kalekian, or a relative of Kalekian who's based in Bursa, has been taking things that he shouldn't be, in quotes, he shouldn't be taking, antiquities that he shouldn't be taking. So it's decided that the Kalekian business will be under surveillance, and then a little bit later it's decided that Kalekian had in fact obtained the permission from the Antiquities Ministry and from the local government in Bursa to take these items. And then only 1 year later, you see Kalekian and his family being sent to America with objects to display those objects in international expositions in America. In particular, you have the very famous exposition in 1893, which he famously, showcased Ottoman objects there for the first time. So there's this idea that the Ottoman state was aware of what they were doing. They sort of checked up on it, and then shortly after there was a reversal where Kalekian was working as a representative of the Ottoman government. So it's likely that, in that turnaround there was some kind of money paid one way or another, although we don't have a record of that, of course. So, however, they seem to have fallen from favour in the 1900s, sometime around 1907, because of perhaps the collapse of the stock market and businesses going bankrupt and being liquidated at that time, perhaps also as a result of collapse of Anatolian networks. So they tend to move away from Constantinople around 1907. They established themselves more in New York. I mentioned already they have a sequence of shops in important areas in New York where they were selling their wares. And also the 1900 period forms a shift in terms of what they were selling, because they start to move away from Ottoman ceramics, Ottoman velvet textiles, Ottoman carpets and so on, and towards Persian ones instead. So it's clear that with the closure of the Constantinople office, they start to move more through Persia. And I'm not sure exactly how they move through, whether they still go through Anatolia or whether they go through Tiflis and, Black Sea trade or something like that. That's something I have to work on. But either way, there's very clear networking with the Persian royal family at this time, around 1903, 1904, 1905. And then, as I mentioned before, Kalekian in particular opens a shop in Cairo and becomes one of the leading exporters of Egyptian antiquities. And in fact, the most cases for restitution have been directed against the Egyptian antiquities of Kalekian in the Metropolitan Museum. That's viewed to be the most problematic in terms of provenance. I find it interesting that many of these merchants or dealers, they start to promote themselves as collectors in their own right at a certain point around the turn of the 19th century, around the same time that they have to close the office in Constantinople. And Dikran Kalekian, for instance, publishes his book, which is a catalogue of his ceramics collection in 1910. And here he writes as a sort of art historian, and he tries to promote the image of Persian ceramics as an equal to the masterpieces of the Renaissance. And so he's trying to show his skills as a connoisseur, as a collector, and not just a dealer. And so they start to move away from this sort of, slightly slimy image of a dealer or a merchant that they developed in the 1890s due to the racial prejudices in a way of the time, and to establish themselves in Europe and in the United States as collectors, not just dealers. And as a result of that as well, they donate huge numbers of ceramics to museums. So there was the Kalekian collection of ceramics that he wrote this catalogue about was actually given as a gift to the Victoria and Albert Museum. It was a temporary loan, but when Kalekian died in 1951, the V&A actually purchased the vast majority of the ceramics, so it ended up staying for life, forever. So that's another thing that's significant. Armenian objects are a bit of a murky thing for me. I haven't engaged in a lot of research about this, and I'll come to this at the end. But it's clear that a number of Armenian objects were sold by these dealers, and they do have slightly problematic provenances. This is a pastoral staff that's described as much damaged in the documentation, and it doesn't describe exactly where it came from, but nevertheless the V&A bought it for £20 in 1903. So, there's a lot more to be done, particularly on the Armenian objects and their very problematic situations coming out of the 1890s massacres and the 1915 genocide, obviously. I've already mentioned Kalekian's notoriety as selling French artists in the United States, and this is actually leading to some reattributions of French paintings actually in museum collections. As part of the donation of all of the remaining artworks that were within the Balyan Family collection to the Metropolitan Museum upon the death of the last executor of the estate, who died only in 2020. So when she died, all of Kalekian's final objects, all of the family objects that they'd retained after his death, were then donated to the Metropolitan Museum. And as part of that, some very significant French paintings that the family had kept for a long time were also passed to the museum, including a wonderful painting of a man by Courbet, which has been simply attributed to Courbet until quite recently. But with the pressure of the Kalekian estate, they've done more provenance research into that painting, and they're getting closer to being able to attribute it to actual Gustave Courbet himself and not just to his school. So it's through research into these dealers that we can change, the attributions of even modern artworks as well as, let's say, Oriental ones. So some further issues that need research. I mentioned the Armenian genocide and Hamidian massacre objects. The wartime. So this is probably one of the most striking documents I've ever seen in my life that says Hail Hitler at the bottom of it, that I saw in Berlin State Museums in October. And this is the correspondence of the transport company, which was called, I think, Schenker & Co., which was taking the objects, as I said, from Paris, which was occupied by the Nazis, to Berlin during the war. So a lot more needs to be done on what was the role of Armenians in this trade. There is a very brilliant researcher who's based in Berlin called Matthias Lammert, and he's written a book that started to unpack these relationships. And he said that in many cases, actually, they had very close relationships with Jewish collectors. And the Jewish collectors, they promised to look after their objects for them, and then the collectors went away to the camps and never came back. So in many cases, there are these really interesting stories that have yet to emerge out of this period. And Armenians weren't necessarily the bad guys. Of course, there were some who were, as always, as with any group of people who were, unscrupulous business people, but there are also many fantastic stories of working together through the war, which are yet to come out. There were also lots of ethical issues. I work on Kalekian, and he had a tragic death where he may have had some sort of illness that was affecting his ability to sort of function mentally towards the end of his life, and he sort of plunged from a very tall building in Manhattan, and there's some sensationalist newspaper reports from the time, and there's also archival correspondence that's sort of quite critical and sort of unpleasant about him. So there's a question, you know, for all of us researchers, how much do we put into our publications about this private family history that we're working on, particularly sensitive history that might be about people with mental health issues or other things at the end of their lives. What might be the research of this kind of results of this kind of research? I'm sure you're familiar with this wonderful book by Hegnar Balyan about the missing pages that were about these canon tables that were taken from a manuscript in Anatolia or Western Armenia, and then eventually they ended up after the War of Independence, or the sort of struggle between the Turkish and the French troops in Cilicia. They were taken to America and ended up in the Getty Museum in America. So as a result of tracing the movement of these canon tables, Hegnar has managed to put pressure through. There was also a big court case in the States through which pressure was applied on the Getty Museum to change the provenance. So this was the website listing here, which changed from I can't remember what it used to be attributed to, but now it's mentioning that it's the property of the Catholicosate of the Great House of Cilicia, and it was given to the Getty Museum as a result of this sort of legal battle. So they can change the listing of the provenance, or restitute, send the object back, or financially compensate. You may have also seen, you can watch actually on it's on YouTube now, a conference a few weeks ago on Armenian genocide looted art. So this is a new initiative that's being led by, again, Hegnar Wharton-Durgaryan, who's based in California in the States. And she's working together with Taner Akçam, who's this great historian of the Armenian genocide, and also Amy Landau, who's a curator at one of the museums in the UCLA Fowler Museum. So they're working together to do a big project on Armenian genocide looted art, and hopefully that will bring results soon. And also research into provenance is picking up in German museums. This is a workshop I attended in October about Jewish Islamic art collections that were looted by the Nazis, and Armenians come quite strongly into that because they were the leading traders of Islamic art at the time. And this is a workshop that's happened only, a couple of months ago by the historians of Islamic art, which again looks into provenance research. So it's very much an area that's taking off. And in 2025 at the Gulbenkian Museum, we are organising an international conference on Armenian dealers. So we're going to invite a range of scholars from around the world to Lisbon to really get to grips with this very interesting and very complex area of research. So that's all I have to say, but thank you for your patience.